I would like to have us all replace any sense of fear we have with a sense of wondrous curiosity. And I'd say for me, my own journey, if I had to pull one of the themes that served me really well, is to approach every institution, every topic, every uh, issue with that sense of really wanting to explore.
Welcome to the Shaping Science podcast, where we talk with experts from science, academia, industry, and beyond to explore the latest in research, education, and innovation for the public good. So I'm Nick Dirks. I'm the president of the New York Academy of Sciences, and today I'm joined by Chandrika Tandon. Chandrika Krishnamurthy Tandon is an Indian-American business leader, musician, and humanitarian. Born in Chennai, India, she graduated from Madras Christian College and later earned her MBA from the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, as only one of 8 women to do so. She began her career at Citibank before becoming the first Indian-American partner at McKinsey & Company, where she specialized in financial institutions and corporate strategy. After leaving McKinsey, she founded Tandon Capital Associates in 1992, a financial advisory firm focused on restructuring and value creation. But it was her parallel journey in music and philanthropy that defined the second half of her career. She studied Indian classical vocal music under Pandit Jasraj, releasing several critically acclaimed albums that bridge Indian and Western traditions, including her most recent album, Triveni, which won her first Grammy for Best New Age, Ambient, or Chant album in 2025. She and her husband, Ranjan, made a historic $100 million gift to New York University in 2015, renaming the engineering school the NYU Tandon School of Engineering. Her philanthropic efforts through the Krishnamurthy Tandon Foundation emphasize access to education, creative expression, and human flourishing. Chandrika, it is such a pleasure to have you with us for our Shaping Science podcast. And of course, I should also mention that you are a member of our Board of Governors, and it is a thrill to have you with us for this podcast today. So let's begin.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to talk with you here. And I'd like to begin by going back to Madras in those days before it was called Chennai, at least in English. You were growing up in Nungambakkam, and you were a dutiful young Indian girl. Your mother thought you should be married off by the age of 18. And to go to college, or rather the college of your choice, you had to actually go on a hunger strike at home to persuade your mother to let you go. Now, that is an act of great will, and clearly you were persuasive, but what was it that drew you out of a kind of traditional upbringing to aspire to have a better education and a career that would take you not only from Chennai to Tambaram, which is where Madras Christian College is, but to Ahmedabad, to New York, to the heights of success you've had both in the business world, but also in the world of arts and music?
You know, it's really interesting. I think one could look at me and say, I have no business being here. Because in a sense, I defy all the odds of what I've done and what everybody in my peer group did at that moment, at that time. So I think it was a lot of big dreams. And I would say one of the most important memories that I have as a very young girl is that I had a grandfather who was very, very dear to me. Mm-hmm. And from the age of, I don't know, I want to say 2 or 3, but I don't think I was reading Shakespeare at 3, but I was pretty much reading William Wordsworth and Daffodils by the time I was 5. I knew the poem. But my whole world was opened up by books and poetry. And so there was never the sense that I was constrained in any way. Even though I was in this very small, very restricted environment, many windows were open to me through books. It was pre-internet, pre-everything. Mm-hmm. So I think that suddenly gave me a whole sense of possibility, which I think is the whole philosophy of science. It's a philosophy of wonder, really, that there's more than what meets the eye, or more than what my little world had. And so anytime anyone put a barrier in front of me, I wanted to see what was over the barrier. And if I was not allowed to climb that barrier, I fought. And so it was a hunger strike, 2 hunger strikes, I might add.
2?
2. One was to go to college, which was an all-male college, which my father and my grandfather had gone to. And you also have sort of an experience with that.
I spent a year on the Madras Christian College campus when I was 12 years old. My father taught there as a Fulbright exchange scholar. And I know it was a men's school. And in fact, there was at that time, and maybe there was in your time, women's Christian college as well. But you chose to go to Madras Christian College.
I chose to go to Madras Christian College for 2 reasons. One is my father and grandfather had gone there, and I felt this great sense of connection to the history of my family having gone there. And my grandfather would talk about stories of Boyd and MacPhail, the founders of the college, because it was founded by the Scottish Jesuit order. The second reason I wanted to go there was that this was the first time that there was a commerce program, a very highly regarded business commerce program for bachelor's degrees that was founded. And I got in. It was a very prestigious program to get into. And I got into that. And then, of course, my dear mother put her foot down. She said, I'm not sending my innocent 14-year-old, I was 14 and a half at that time because I finished school early. I'm not sending you to an all-male college an hour away.
You went to college when you were 14.
I was 15 when I started, and I finished college when I was 18.
Yeah,
and then I went to business school when I was 18.
And you had to do a hunger strike to go to business
school as well? And I had to go
to,
yes. And I was really lucky because this tells you about the power of mentors, because in both cases, in going to college, my hunger strike was amply supported by the headmistress of my school, Sister Mary Nesson, this Irish nun who I'd never seen leave this convent. And for the first time in from 12 years in school, she actually left the school in her white car and came to my house to tell my mother, Mrs. Krishnamurthy, you must let her go. She will not bring us dishonor. And the same thing pretty much happened when I got into IIM Ahmedabad. Again, it was a defiance because I didn't know what IIM Ahmedabad was. I wasn't even going to go into business education. I was so clearly going to be a lawyer. I was going to be in the judicial path. And
which is what your father...
My grandfather was a judge, and my other grandfather was a lawyer, was a leading criminal lawyer. But so for me, I was very good in law. I topped the university in law. So it seemed like a great thing to do. I loved the law. But then an uncle who, the day before or something like that, he said to me, oh, you think you're IIM Ahmedabad? Oh, you must be crazy. You're never going to get in. It's like winning a Nobel Prize or something.
Incredible.
Because there used to be 100,000 students that would apply, and 100 of us got in. And most of the people that got in...
It's harder to get into than getting into Harvard or Yale.
For sure, yeah. And most of the people that got in I was among the youngest by a lot in my class, because most of the people that got in had finished a 5-year degree, typically had some work experience. So they were several years older than I was. So that was my journey. And then I didn't look back.
Yeah. So you graduated from IIM, and then you started working with Citibank.
In Beirut.
In
war-torn
during
Beirut.
The Civil War,
1975. Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
It was really getting thrown into the deep end without knowing you're in the deep end.
Now, you went there not to be there for the Civil War. You obviously were sent there by Citibank to
have the training. Citibank had a global training for the whole Middle East, North Africa, and the European region. So there's probably 30 of us that were management trainees who were accepted into this very, very prestigious program of Citibank. That was what we were recruited for. We were 3 of us that got recruited from IIM Ahmedabad, 2 other guys. And we were there for about 4 months. And my flight was one of the very last to leave Beirut. They shut the airport down. But I lived in such unimaginable horror because we would drive to work in the morning and then come back and find that buildings were burning on either side. Very often we would be asked to move into a hotel because sniper attacks were everywhere. But you understood the cost of human devastation. You understood what war did to this most beautiful city, where
Beirut before 75 was this kind of jewel by the Mediterranean
and it was
Sea.
where Rausche, which is this waterfront where the ocean meets the mountains, and the Corniche, which is exquisite. It was the first time I'd left the country, and so for me this was learning and about myself. It was learning about a different culture. It was learning about the horrors of war firsthand. And it was learning about being a completely different being. In a way, I was able to navigate lots of streets in Beirut because I looked different. And I wore a sari. I didn't own any Western clothes. And I kind of got by doing a lot of things with that. I'll tell you one story which has still stood with me. I wanted to see this movie Lust for Life, which was a Vincent van Gogh story. And there was a theater playing it, so a friend of mine and I decided to go to the movie. And we had all of like a few pounds with us. I mean, it was nothing, a pittance. The guy told us, "I'm sorry, it's 400 pounds to see this." We couldn't even think of it. We just said, "No, thank you," and we left. That evening, that theater was razed to the ground.
Oh my goodness!
It just razed to the ground in the next couple of hours, and then so there were a lot of near skirmishes, near misses, and so you understand the fragility of life. And
these are pretty hard lessons to learn as a young woman, and you were
at 20.
Obviously leaving India for the first time.
Yes.
So eventually, they decide you better leave, and
Citibank transported all of us out of there.
Yeah.
Through.
But you went back to India?
We went back to India, and then worked there for about 3 years before I went to McKinsey.
Yeah. So you made the move to McKinsey. That's going beyond Beirut, obviously going to New York. I seem to recall you telling me at some point that you landed in New York and you were still, of course, wearing a sari, wearing sandals, but it was midwinter.
Blizzard. And during the worst blizzard of America in New York. This was in 1978. We had the most horrible blizzard, and I came here in that, wearing a thin silk sari, chappals. I'd never seen snow. I didn't know anything about New York. And it was truly, again, I got into McKinsey. It's a whole long story, but then I didn't have the safe runway of coming into a university, which most people do when they come into work in America, especially at that time. They would come in, be in college for a couple of years, either a master's program or a PhD program. I came straight in.
You came straight
went to McKinsey and went straight to the boardroom, not knowing how to drive, not knowing anything about the culture of this incredible country. And I spoke funny because, in a sense, I had a different accent. It isn't at that time, which is 1979 by now. People weren't looking at me and saying, "Wow, India is the land of outsourcing," or "India is this," or whatever. I was a strange bird. People would tell me stories of that one person that cheated them somewhere, or ask me about the red dot, or some sort of crazy conversations we would have.
But in McKinsey, I mean, you must have been one of the only...
Almost. We were very few Indians, and I was definitely the only Indian woman by a long, in the whole world. And McKinsey was a very small firm at that time, and a very, very high-intensity firm where I learned so much.
And did you begin your time at McKinsey working on bank restructuring, or
New York? Yeah, I worked with financial institutions. I actually started with a consumer goods company. So I worked on several industries, but then gravitated or was assigned.
But very quickly, you realized you could go into a bank and you could figure out ways in which they could restructure that would just transform the way in which business operations
See, because you
would take
come
place.
off a very, very highly regulated environment. We were still in Glass-Steagall. We were still in a whole regulated environment. And when you have a regulated environment, the institutions have a lot less incentive to perform. So what had happened is and then the other historical dynamic in the financial institutions industry in America was that many of the banks had become larger through consolidation. So they would acquire other smaller institutions or merge with other institutions. But you put that together with the fact that you had regulation at the same time. suddenly you had this absolutely bloated infrastructures. And in fact, I would go into institutions and they'd say there's a red bank and a blue bank and a green bank because they never figured out how to put things together. So processes were very squiggly. Things to open a loan would be 19 steps. So this is what I discovered and worked on.
This is even more extraordinary is the fact that the banks that you came from in India were not at all, streamlined operations. I still remember, and in the 1970s, I was in India and I was doing research and I was getting my stipend from my fellowship, and I had to go to the State Bank of India, and it took me 3 hours to withdraw my monthly stipend. And I used to have to get tokens and go from one desk to another window, wait, so on and so forth.
And the Indian banks were at the highest extreme of regulation. And
so
they
somehow
continued to be.
you
but
must
I
have
didn't
been
work
able
for
to
an Indian
see
bank.
through. That's right.
I worked for Citibank. But having said that, it wasn't my banking experience from India that helped me really understand this. Because by the time I had worked at McKinsey, by then I was a partner, my work particularly was my first restructuring when I because I was doing a lot of work around not just banks, around all kinds of institutions, service institutions really, from culture to strategy to organization to product market strategies to global expansion. I had one situation. It was 1986. We had a Banco Lar Brasileiro, which is a Brazilian bank. The bank was losing money hand over fist every month. We didn't understand. The CEO didn't understand where the money was going. There were currency issues, the Cruzada, the Cruzeiros, all of that.
Right.
Then McKinsey was called in. I was a partner in charge of that study. And I lived in Brazil. And we literally, over the next 8 months, we took this bank apart, the CEO and I, piece by piece, with the management team, of course, but I was his main advisor. We literally redid every piece of that bank. We took this from a completely failing bank into one of the most successful banks in the firmament in that environment. It took us a while. It took us 8 months for the major restructuring. That suddenly started me to think that, wow, this is incredible. And by the way, there's so many similarities between different financial institutions because the way they operate, the way they do their trading, the way they do their customer, their corporate relationships, the way they do their branch banking, globally it's the same. So then I said, why don't we standardize our thinking about this? But of course, that's not where, McKinsey wasn't. We were about broad strategy. We were about big ideas. And that's what I had been working on. But suddenly I had been into the bowels of the organization from top to bottom. So that's when I started to look at both the top, but at the bottom. So looking at the detailed processes while you're looking at the strategy of the institution. And that became a very exciting process of which, by the way, that whole learning has stayed with me in everything I do now. So I don't even look at anything just only from the top, whether it's working with NYU or working on a project or working with anything. I start to go vertically down to understand every detail of what it is that needs to, what it is that's not working at the bottom while you're figuring out the top. Because too often we are so much at the top. And this has been an incredible learning journey for me continuously. And I say that even now.
But you go into institutions, and I want to move to from banks to institutions like universities. Or for that matter, nonprofits like the New York Academy of Sciences. But you're uniquely able to figure out how the kind of overall strategy on the one side and the overall structure somehow often is mismatched with the way in which actual systems and processes work. But that takes a remarkable kind of both analytic and synthetic capacity to do that.
But I really have to give McKinsey a lot of credit for that amazing training, because I think what happens is when you work with the best of the best in McKinsey, you really, and you're put into situations, and if you decide to take it completely seriously to deliver the best that you can, learning from both the client, you understand you can't walk in and do 20 charts which talk about in some bullshit way that the market is growing or whatever. You really have to be very thoughtful, and you have to really put yourself in the shoes of the CEO. And when you've been through enough situations and had enough knocks going through understanding what you could have done better, you then develop the sense that it's not enough. You can't simply operate at the 20,000-foot level. You have to develop an MRI vision of what it is. It's like doing a whole body MRI while you have an understanding as a doctor about what broader things could be off. So it's understanding every structure. It's not just the bone structure, but the cell structure and all of that. And knowing what questions to ask to get there.
So you decided at some point, having attained great success at McKinsey, to set up your own consulting company precisely to use that kind of approach to, as it were, go off on your own. But you had to once again do something that, most McKinsey partners don't do.
My idea was very simple. I felt that I wanted to, this is such an inefficient industry, and there was huge wealth to be made for people to buy these institutions and restructure them. So I wanted investors to go in and shake them up because these institutions were so poorly run. It wasn't that I wanted to do it, but I wanted to help other people do it. So this was my whole model of going into an inefficient industry and figuring out how to make them efficient. And if people benefited from that, that's great. But one thing you find is that every institution needs an incentive to change. And if you just say excellence, it's not a great motivator. The sense of urgency has to come from something else. So that sense of urgency when I set up my firm came from investors who decided to take stakes in these institutions and shake them up. And of course, what happened, as it did in the financial services industry, is that at that time the market fell apart because there was a lot of non-performing assets, and so many banks got into trouble, and there was a big rash of consolidations that started to happen. So the predatory aspect of
Right.
consolidation started to take place. And so it was a ripe time to be a disclosable event of the SEC because, every investor wanted me to go in and work with them.
Now, you've worked with a lot of different institutions
Yes.
over the course of your career, not just banks and not just in your business. You turned increasingly to philanthropic engagements with a number of, and you've been on many boards and been involved in cultural and research and educational institutions, among others. But I'd love to hear a little bit about the journey you took with NYU, because that's been in some sense, your longest standing relationship.
My deepest one.
Yeah. And of course, you and your husband gave this magnificent gift to what is now the Tandon School. But it was, in previous decades, it was Brooklyn Poly. It was absorbed by NYU in order to bring an engineering school to an expanding and great New York university. But when did you become involved, and when did you begin to see the potential? And how did you think also about what needed to be done to change and restructure in order to really realize the kind of ambitions that NYU had for its engineering program? How did you come to see this as a place that you wanted to invest both your time and your resources in?
My engagement with NYU started in 1999. And it started because I had a crisis of spirit, I'll call it. Because while I was going through this building my company, I decided at some point that, and it's a longer tale, but I decided at some point that I wanted to restructure my life to give back, to spend my time, talent, and treasure in a meaningful way beyond just for myself and my immediate needs and my family and so on. And so, while I was thinking that in my head, thinking I really do want to broaden my engagement with the world at large, I was invited by the dean of the Stern School of Business, NYU Stern School of Business, to become their distinguished executive in residence at the Stern School. And of course, it was a beautiful entry at that time. He just says, well, Tom Cooley was his name. He passed away recently, a few years ago. And he said, well, if you just come in and spend 2 or 3 hours a week, I'll give you an office here. I mean, I was running my company. I had an office. And he said, I'll give you an office here, but, it would be so helpful. After he and I had met a couple of times, we liked each other a great deal. Before you knew what had happened, that had morphed into 3 days a week. I was pretty much at the Stern School. I was teaching classes. I was collaborating with professors. I went to all the faculty lunches. He wanted me to become one of his deans. There was so many opportunities. I loved engaging with this institution. I loved engaging. Now, of course, I wasn't part of the university. I wasn't engaged with the university at large, but just at the Stern School.
Right.
But we did a lot of very interesting things. I became sort of his advisor, which is, and really got into every part of the school. And he gave me free access and was very open. And then I loved being with this brilliant faculty. Now, of course, one thing led to another. And then John Sexton and Marty Lipton, the chair of the board and the president of NYU, invited me to join the NYU Board of Trustees. Because by then I'd also joined the Stern Board of Overseers.
Right. So what year did you join the Board of Trustees of NYU?
Probably 4 or 5 years after I'd been at Stern. So it's probably, I want to say 2005 or 2003 or 4. And, Stern gave me all the medals, the Walter Nichols medal. I mean, because I was just there. I mean, my whole self was thrown into Stern.
The idea of going for 2 or 3 hours a week morphed into obviously
3
a
full
huge
days.
resource for the Stern School.
And then I taught, and I did restructuring classes. I did career sessions with the kids. I did cohort. I did more commencement speeches. I was in the school all the time. And we really were on a mission to make Stern one of the top schools. So, and I was part of the strategy work that the dean was doing. Then I joined the university board, and John Sexton invited me, which was involved with the New York Academy of Science.
During those very years, I was asking about the dating because in part, it was, I think, in 2005 or 2006 that John became the chair of the board of governors of the New York Academy of Sciences.
Right. So you're right. So in parallel, he invited me, and Marty Lipton, who was the chair of the NYU board, invited me to join the NYU board, and then he gave me the position of chair of global for NYU. So, and NYU was
which you've done ever since.
Which I've done ever since, and which has been a very important initiative as making the global network university was a very big deal for NYU. And so that was, again, engaging myself with full immersion. I went into all the different sites of NYU. I traveled to every site, traveled to every school to understand how each of the schools worked. NYU's got a vast network of schools. I'd already been at Stern. I still was at Stern. And in that journey, over the next, which took me a year or two to complete, because I went to every location. I went to Paris, I went to Madrid, I went to Prague, and went to London, met the faculty, met the students, because I wanted to understand and develop my own independent fact base. As I said, this is part of
That's
going
how you would look at
to
institutions,
Yeah, because I didn't want to go in there, because it's easy to be a board member and just go into a board meeting and give your 3 thoughts and leave, or not, or just go there and be silent and leave. I didn't want to do that. I don't want to do that with any place I'm engaged with. And so that's what happened, Nick, and part of that journey. And then over some period of time, over the next several years, I was invited to the board. I was on multiple dean search committees, and I was invited to join the board of the Wagner School. So I served the Wagner board for a few years while still being on the Stern board, on the NYU board. So I was vice chairman of the board. So I just was doing a lot of work, just loving it. This is something that the mission of being engaged with students and seeing their hopes and dreams and seeing the brilliance of faculty and seeing how selfless they are on the one hand and how brilliant they are on the other hand, and the conflicts and challenges they face. That was also a very interesting human study. And I'd say the other thing which was also interesting in this whole journey was understanding the limitations and the challenges of an academic institution.
Yeah. Which is, of course, different than
completely
financial
different
institutions or other
from
institutions.
any corporate institution, because the pressures are different, the motivations are different, and the constraints are different. And so I had to learn over a long learning process and a long acceptance process of a different model that works and doesn't work sometimes.
Right.
So that was it. In that journey over the next several years, we had just gotten into a deeper relationship with Brooklyn Polytechnic. Because I was on the executive committee of the board, and we were very engaged. And that was a school I would just, over the 2 years, I would go in there, sit I just, the dean had invited me to the board meetings. Jerry Hulton, who's also...
Well, another point of connection with the New York Academy of Sciences, our past chair of the board was at that point running Brooklyn Poly, right?
Exactly. And so Jerry would invite me to just come in and, this is the wonderful thing about NYU. They opened up doors wherever. Nobody held on tight and said, don't come in. It was just open to come in. So for about 2 years, I watched the school. I watched what was happening. And I started to get into the issues of science and technology, something I hadn't spent a lot of time on because I'd been mostly coming at everything from a business lens and increasingly from an artistic lens.
Right. And we'll get to that in a minute.
But these were the two pillars I was focused on. But then here I was, this was 2011, 12, 13 at this time. And I'd been spending a huge amount of time. And we got into this question about engaging and NYU getting more involved in the Polytechnic. So it was NYU Polytechnic at that time.
Now, this was a really interesting moment in New York for engineering.
Yes.
I can't remember the exact year when Michael Bloomberg, as mayor, had made a call to different institutions.
That was a couple of years later.
Okay, it was about the same, but it was around the same time because New York had not had a very distinguished engineering school anywhere, and it had a number of them, including at Columbia, where I had been. There was a small school of engineering, but there wasn't a major presence for engineering in New York, despite the fact that...
Also, if you looked at Brooklyn Polytechnic at that time, the school was very poorly ranked. This was a school which was an extraordinarily prestigious and powerful place many years ago, but which had seen its best times.
Right.
So when NYU sort of brought it into its fold, it was ranked in the low, I want to say 87, something in that range.
Really?
It's not the exact number, but something in that range. And so the school rested a lot on its past laurels, but its current position was in a very different place. And then it was in a far different place than where NYU, the institution, was. And the second thing that was also important to know is that the school's composition of students was a very different composition than the rest of NYU. And NYU's composition is already a different composition from most universities, because we are already a very tuition-dependent institution. We have a New York population, international, of course, but a lot of Pell Grant eligible students and all of that at NYU. But Poly was in a different league of its own because most of the students, we had a very high percentage of first-gen students. I mean, I want to say in the high 40s. We had a high percentage of Pell Grant eligible students. And so the population of the school, and there was an entrepreneurial school, very different, perhaps not with the same academic standards that NYU had. So that was it was a brilliant move by John and Marty to have brought Polytechnic into NYU. But here we had this incredible
But now you had to do something with it.
We had to do something with it, and it required an investment. And so the more I spent time at the school, it started to become clear to my husband and me that, look, there are many changes that have happened in the world. Changes that have happened in the world in the last 2 or 3 decades that we both know. I mean, email didn't exist 20 years ago. And, we don't even now, there are different phases of evolution. But if you step back and look at it, technology has shaped a lot of that change, a lot of behavior change.
Right.
And here we looked at the engineering school and said, look, here is the future. It's not just what is happening within the engineering school, but it's the skills that we would develop around technology in that school, which can then be parlayed into different parts of the university because technology is going to affect health, technology is going to affect the arts, technology is going to affect education. I mean, we were prescient in a way that we saw it as clearly as we did. And the other most important thing, I'd say, which kind of superseded even this, was a report which said that when our students graduated from Polytechnic, from NYU Polytechnic at that time, our students had one of the highest salaries of anybody.
Really?
in the tri-state area. And so you look at this and say, in fact, they had the second highest salaries. Medical assistants were first, and we were the second. And in the tri-state area, we were the second biggest thing. So just look at the possibility. Your first generation students, you're able to give them an economic career. You've given them a set of skills which are going to vault them into being important players in the 21st century. Because without that, they would be left behind. It would be a generation left behind. So this, for us, it was a no-brainer. It was almost like, wow, let's just do whatever we can, because this is the wave of the future. We can talk a lot about many things. And of course, now as we sit here in our foundation and my work now, we have two pillars: economic empowerment and emotional empowerment.
Mm-hmm.
And the fundamentals of economic empowerment, to me, are education with a strong understanding of technology.
Mm-hmm.
Because without that, you will really be lost in the world that is being formed under your very eyes. And then the second piece of it is emotional empowerment, which is where the arts, I know we keep talking about STEAM and all of that, but I actually think they're two different issues, really. Important. We need to talk about both, because what's the point of being economically sustainable but being a miserable SOB? That doesn't help us either. You want people to be whole people. So I think it's both of that. And so to me, this was a very important propeller of what we could do. So a big initiative, and we did a lot. And the dean at that time was who I worked with very, very closely. It was one of the most exciting journeys of my life, because we transformed the school.
Yeah,
we went the school went into the 30s in terms of ranking, which is the highest.
From the 80s to the 30s.
It was the 80s, but by the time then it had gone
and
down.
Engineering, just for our audience, we should say that there are very big institutions that command the top 10 or 20.
Yes, like MIT and
MIT, but also Midwestern institutions like Purdue and the University of Michigan,
right. and they've been there for a very long time, and it requires huge investment.
Yeah.
To do that. They have big endowments that they do that. So for us, this was a very big deal that we were able to do that. But I'll tell you, the other thing we did is that we really created extraordinary placement approaches to make sure that every kid that came in and spent the money for a college education ended up with a great job at the end of it. And look, the other thing is that this was not a small school. A lot of the engineering schools are very small.
Right.
When you look at Caltech or MIT, they have a few hundred students. This is several thousand students. NYU Engineering had almost 6,000 students. So this was a large school where the transformation was a very big effort. And I have to give a huge amount of credit to John and his team for pulling it off. I was not.
Well, you were a major part of that story, and
no, I was one of their greatest cheerleaders.
Yeah, but in the since I'm looking at a clock, and I realize we have so much more to cover. So I want to just stop you for a second, and then also rewind to the point where you said you began to think about trying to make an impact in the world outside of your own career, but you were also turning at that point in life to your music. When did you begin to think about music as something you would go back to and begin performing in a serious way? Was that also at the same time?
It's around 1999. I would say I had this epiphany, or a crisis of spirit, as I call it, where I had to re-examine my whole life, and I had to re-examine my definitions of success. Because I had lived in one mantra of success until then. I was getting ahead, whether it was McKinsey. It wasn't money ever, but I wanted to become a partner in McKinsey. And then I wanted to create major change in the financial services industry with my firm. And I was going nonstop, and I was going from one milestone to another. And I had a real crisis. And then I said, I've got to make sure that in the remaining time I have left, whatever that is, that I really look at moments that give me great joy. And I realized that the best moments of my life had to do with music. So I know, Nick, I decided to include music as part of my life, as a calendar adjustment. It wasn't to perform.
Oh, I see.
I simply wanted to sing and enjoy and feel the joy that music gives me.
So it was, in fact, for emotional empowerment.
Completely. And it was because I loved singing. If I hear an air conditioner, I'm thinking of music. I'm always composing in my head. In fact, my clients would tease me, Chandrika, is that you humming? You know, it's kind of what I do. There's a foot always in that door. But as it happened, my father-in-law had his 90th birthday, and I said to myself, what do you give a man who's turning 90? And I decided to make a little album of his music. And then it developed a cult following, and a label guy came and asked if he could please release it. And then
that was nominated for a Grammy.
The next one was nominated for a Grammy. This one was a small album that I just did, like a homegrown one. But then I released it afterwards. But the first then proper album that I did was nominated for a Grammy. With Sergio Mendes, by the way. My other nominee was Sergio Mendes, who was my hero. I grew up on his Brazil 66. So this was a big moment.
So you went from humming to a Grammy-nominated album.
Yes.
And then you began performing as well.
Then what happened is it just started to blossom from there. And I really couldn't take on a career as a full-time musician. It wasn't what I wanted to do. So I could have done that.
It's extraordinary that, you have this level of success in your business work. You have this level of success in your engagements with a number of institutions, most importantly NYU. And then you have this level of success with music that you turn to for other reasons, but nevertheless becomes another vehicle. And it becomes a vehicle for you to express a certain kind of both relationship with aesthetics and spiritual commitment and directionality. But you have all these different things going on. You always do so incredibly powerful work wherever you're directing your attention. But you in your life are bringing together, the phrase we use in university life, the arts and the sciences, in a way that seems totally integral. We talk about two cultures sometimes in the university, or we talk about, the kind of separations that exist between the engineering quad and the humanities quad or the arts quad. You bring them all together.
And I think we have to do that. And for me, that's really been the most exciting part of my own journey. As I say, the economic side and, the hard side and the soft side are much more intertwined than we know. And one of the biggest speeches I would make on every commencement or every address I made to the students, even the engineering school, would be, you can be the greatest technicians in the world. And they are. I mean, some of the students that I have met are beyond brilliant, and the faculty too. But remember why we are there. We are there to change society, to solve the problems of society. And if you lose the heart, and if you lose the understanding and the sense of wonder and the sense of curiosity about the problems of society, you will never be a good engineer. Turn around to the other side. So I'm in the music space, and I'm in the art space, and I'm in the space of consciousness, because the part which we haven't spoken about is the part that's integrated all of this, is a very deep practice of breath work and meditation that I have. The more we go into that space, we understand that technology has a big role to play. The whole space of health has been transformed by technology. 12 years ago, I released my first album, and the whole way albums are consumed and delivered and, music is actually handled is completely different, because technology has obliterated and changed everything. So for anybody, and the flip side is, and I've been on the board of Berklee and the President's Council of the Berklee School of Music and other schools of music. And I'm appalled when students who are incredible artists have no life skills and don't understand some of the hard skills. Because I think it's very important that we allow our students and allow everybody to be a little bit more unbounded in how they approach the world. And I think as human beings, we have multiple dimensions. And there's no reason for us to get so pigeonholed and pocketed into one track.
So the way you come at this is thinking about, ultimately what makes a whole person and how
Yes.
can we live a life that is both a life of impact, making the world better, but also a life of meaning, which is connecting us to our fundamental humanity. But, if you look at it from, again, the other side, we're now at a time when technology is developing at a rate in a way that is making some people worry that the human is at risk, that, the machine is going to overtake our humanity. What you show in all your work is that the two, in fact, are integrally connected if you do a certain set of things the right way. So we're almost out of time, but I was wondering if you would leave us with some thoughts about how to maintain this level of connectivity between the expressive, aesthetic, and spiritual dimensions of what it is to be human, with the fact that we live in a world in which technology is going to become ever more powerful and potentially ever more useful, but also potentially more dangerous.
I would like to have us all replace any sense of fear we have with a sense of wondrous curiosity. And I'd say for me, my own journey, if I had to pull one of the themes that served me really well, is to approach every institution, every topic, every uh, issue with that sense of really wanting to explore. I mean, one of the things I do is very often I get 6 or 7 or 8 faculty together from different disciplines to just understand. There's nothing I have to offer, but it's just to understand. And the more you ask questions, the more your own understanding grows at an exponential way. And you're able to give insights which individually people can't, because people are so locked in their own perspective, in their own little pigeonhole, as I call it. So I would say the imperative for all of us at this stage is not for us to, technology is here to stay. And yeah, we can spend all our time quetching about the fear and what it's going to do. And perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. Perhaps it'll be, it'll have its moments. And it does. And there'll be deep fakes, and there'll be deeper fakes. And but there will be the diagnostic brilliance that comes out of different forms. All of it is going to happen. But we, each one of us, whatever our stage of life is going to have to be in a state of, it takes work, of wonder and curiosity to stay relevant and to understand what's happening and to participate. Otherwise, you'd be a bystander who's got a lot of stuff to say without much to add.
Well, your life and these words are a kind of inspiration both to me, but also to everyone who interacts with you. And, to have you as a member of the Board of Governors of the New York Academy, where you can bring the sense both of the power of science and technology, but also of the need to always align it with these other goals. It's a real honor. So thank you.
Can I say one last thing?
Yes, of course.
I think it's also very important for everybody to have a purpose which is beyond themselves. I think when you're serving a higher goal, whatever that goal is, then your life just becomes just a wondrous life.
Well, I could not agree more. And thank you so much for joining us on Shaping Science, our podcast at the New York Academy of Sciences. But we'll have to bring you back and talk more, because I feel like we only scratched the surface.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. A pleasure to be part of the New York Academy of Sciences. It's got a big pivotal role to play in the world. And in New York.
And in New York. Thank you, Chandrika.
Thanks.
To learn more about the New York Academy of Sciences, including information on upcoming events, visit us online at nyas.org and follow us at NIAS Sciences. Shaping Science is made possible with the generous support of Tata Sons.